So, shall we turn to your working career? Would you like to say a few things about your first job, how it came up?
Yeah, well, my first job was at King's College London, and it came up through Philip Sherrard, whose name I've already mentioned. Philip lived between Greece and London, and at that time, in fact, he got a job as lecturer in the history of the Orthodox Church at King's College London. He was the first and only holder of this post, and he was only there for a few years. But he was one of the people with Richard Clogg. Richard Clogg was also there at the time. He had just started, excuse me, as lecturer in modern Greek history. And Richard and Philip became good friends as well as colleagues. I mean, friends between themselves. But I'd already met both of them. And they, I think, were the ones who decided to try to get a new post set up at King's in modern Greek literature. And so that post was set up, it was advertised while I was in Greece. And Philip wrote to me or told me in some way that this job was coming up, and he hoped that I would apply. I applied, I came to London, was interviewed, and I was appointed starting in October. I was already living in Greece, so I went back to Greece and stayed there, I suppose, until September, and at which point I came back to England. And I had that job at King's College London for 7.5 years, and I set up all the courses in modern Greek language and literature, because the post hadn't existed before.
What did you teach?
What did I teach? Well, I taught practically everything. I mean, I taught language and I taught literature, and I taught the whole thing. From Solomos to the present day, I suppose, in literature. And yeah, it was quite difficult. I mean, I had quite a lot of teaching hours, as I continue to have at Oxford as well. But we managed to find a teaching assistant, a Greek who did the practical language work, but she was only working part-time. But anyway, I very much enjoyed working with Philip Sherrard and Richard Clogg. When I say working with, I mean, we were in the same department, but Richard Clogg certainly was teaching modern Greek history to the same students that I was teaching language and literature to. Philip Sherrard, because he was doing the history of the Orthodox Church, well, he had his own students, they were not the students that I was teaching. And it was during that time, I should explain that when I was appointed in London, it was a joint appointment. It was supposed to be half paid by King's College and half paid by the School of Slavonic and East European Studies. And it was at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies that I met Jackie, who later became my wife, and I met her at the first, my first Christmas party of the School of Slavonic Studies. And she was working there in the administration, in the secretarial office. She was secretary of the Russian department, and she studied Russian. So we've been together now for 40 years, I'm sorry. So that was my great gain from being at the School of Slavonic Studies, although I didn't actually teach many people there. Most of my courses were done at King's College. So my social activities were more at the School of Slavonic Studies, and my teaching was at King's College.
And your students were Brits, Greeks?
Well, there were three categories, I suppose. There were people who were totally non-Greek. There were people from Greece or Cyprus, and then, of course, there were London Cypriots as well. That is, children of Cypriot parents who, spoke English really, or rather their English was better than their Greek because all their schooling was done in English, but they spoke Greek at home to their parents and their grandparents or whatever. So it's quite interesting trying to put all these together and trying to make some sense out of how do you pitch your, especially the language teaching, of course, was difficult with three completely different categories of people. Anyway, I wasn't terribly happy about King's College. Somehow I felt, being an Oxford graduate, I was thinking it would be rather nice to go back to Oxford or perhaps Cambridge. And then when this job came up at Oxford, when my modern Greek tutor Robin Fletcher retired, I applied for the job, and I was appointed here in Oxford at the beginning of 1981, so in January 1981, that's when I left King's. And Jackie, although she didn't know Oxford, she never lived in Oxford, she came with me. We moved house from London to Oxford, into this house here that we're sitting in now, in 1981, and we've never regretted having moved from London, actually. I mean, we go to London quite frequently, but we like it here in Oxford. It's a very nice environment. And here, I think, at least in the first few years, I found the teaching environment was easier. I seemed to have to do fewer hours of work. I was very lucky to find already in post a language teaching assistant, Mary Colton, who was half Greek and half Scottish, and she was appointed, in fact, just one term, a few months before me, and she continued all the way through my career here. She was my only close colleague, in fact, and we worked together a lot, and we became friends, and she was absolutely wonderful. So she did. She was very, very good at the. She did the language side of things, and I did the literature.
You also did the history. You
yes,
introduced the history course.
During that period, so from 81 till 2000, I actually took early retirement at the age of 2003. During that period, I suppose, let's say around about the mid-90s, perhaps before, the early 90s, I decided I would bring in a new obligatory course, compulsory course for first-year students on modern Greek history. It was actually history of the 20th century. And since there was nobody else around to teach it, I had to teach it myself. But I thought, you know, when you're studying French or German, it's fairly easy to pick up French or German history if you want to. And anyway, perhaps it's not so important to reading the literature anyway. But if you're reading modern Greek literature, you've got to know about the history. You know, how do you read Solomos? How do you read Papadiamanis? How do you read Seferis, etc., etc.? How do you read these people without knowing the history?
The historical context.
And so that I introduced that, and I taught that. But I also introduced a course for classicists, in other words, for students who were not my own students, but they were classic students, who used to come to me and study modern Greek poetry. So I was doing Seferis and Kalafi with these classicists, and I felt this was very good. They were very good students. That was very stimulating for me. I learned a lot from them. And I should say, actually, I've learned a lot in general from my students. I mean, one's students are, especially graduate students, are the people that one learns most from, perhaps. And also, many of my graduate students became friends and have remained friends and are still friends today. Many of them, of course, are Greeks, but some of them are not. And because of the fact that modern Greek is such a small subject, those of us who are teaching it in Britain, and that was only really at 4 universities, Birmingham, Cambridge, King's College London and Oxford, we decided in 1981, in fact the initiative came from Margaret Alexiou in Birmingham, we decided to form a committee that tried to coordinate somehow modern Greek studies in Britain. I mean, each university of course had its own curriculum, its own syllabus, but we tried to put on, or we did put on, some joint events. So every year we put on 2 joint events with the 4 universities combined, and people from other universities who were interested as well, both teachers and students. One of these was an undergraduate course, which would be a weekend. It was called the Greek Weekend. And the other one was a postgraduate colloquium for postgraduate students to give papers. And this was great fun. We really enjoyed doing these things. It was great to be able to teach students from other universities, to meet students from other universities, and of course it was great for the students to be taught by teachers from other universities too, because generally the students were being taught by one person or 2 people, and that was it.
So this was something like a forum for modern Greek studies.
That's right, and we would also have meetings, just the teachers, exchange ideas and information, etc. But also going back to friendship with graduate students, I also made friends with a lot of graduate students who were not my graduate students, but graduate students at other universities who are still friends of mine today. And also in Oxford, I was lucky enough because, although I said nobody was teaching modern Greek history at undergraduate level, there was John Campbell here, who was trained as an anthropologist, and he was also a historian, and he had a lot of very good graduate students. And he was, and I met a lot of his students, and a lot of other Greek graduate students, especially historians, who were studying in Oxford, who have remained friends of mine. So, I mean, some of my best friends in Greece include Charis Vlavianos, Dimitris Livanios, Vasilis Gounaris, Thanos Veremis, of course, had been here as well, but that's before I came here to teach. But, you know, there are quite a few Greek historians who are now teaching in Greek universities who I met because they were studying in Oxford, not with me, but with John Campbell or somebody else, and who I met and became friends with. And it was very useful, actually, my wife, because my wife was here working at St Anthony's College, which is where John Campbell was, and it's also where Richard Cole went when John Campbell retired.
So, would you say that these were the years that modern Greek studies as a field was actually formed in Britain, and
yeah, I
there
think
was
so. Well,
a growing community
of
flourishing.
It was flourishing.
British trained
I mean, as you know, there's nobody teaching modern Greek history. There's nobody with a post in modern Greek history at any British university now.
Yes.
Whereas in the past there was the one at London and there was the one at Oxford. The post at Oxford, though, was only it's too difficult to go into details, but the holder of the modern Greek post at St Anthony's was not actually, he didn't have any teaching duties in the university at undergraduate level. So John Campbell and Richard Clogg both supervised postgraduate students, but they didn't teach at undergraduate level, so there was no proper programme in modern Greek history, but at least they had these graduate students, and they were, almost every single graduate student that they had was, you know, one of the top, among the top people, you know, the sort of names that I mentioned. Mark Mazar was another one, you know, who did modern Greek history here with John Campbell. And Michael Hertzfeldt did anthropology with him, you know, people who have become world famous in their fields. So it was a great time, and somehow, yes, modern Greek studies seem to be flourishing in a way that they're not now. I don't think there was more, I mean, there was not more interest in the sense that there were no more undergraduates then than there are now. I mean, it was always a very, very small number of people, and I think from the time that I arrived here at Oxford in '81 to the time that I left, and even to now, I think it's been more or less the same number of undergraduates. It's a very small number.
If it's not a question of numbers, what is it about? I mean, why has it declined now?
It's very difficult to say. I mean, at the time when I started doing modern Greek, just teaching modern Greek at King's, you know, that was a wonderful time because it was the time of the colonels, because, you know, people were interested in Greece, they were interested in contemporary Greece. You know, what was happening in Greece politics was, you know, it was one of the places where the future of European democracy was being decided. You know, it was a crucial place. You know, like we're all interested in Ukraine now and all that. But people were interested in Greece at that time, and even after that, you know, the sort of it took a long time for that interest in Greece to subside. And, you know, with Seferis having got the Nobel Prize in '63 and Elitis getting the Nobel Prize in whatever it was, '79, you know, this interest still continued for some years afterwards. But, you know, unfortunately, this interest has really gone down tremendously nowadays. I mean, my colleague, I should say my successor, Dimitris Papanikolaou, who teaches modern Greek here now in Oxford, I mean, he has a very good group of, you know, very lively group of undergraduates and graduate students. You know, the numbers haven't changed, and you know, the students, I'm sure, are just as good as they were. I'm talking about the general interest, you know, sort of outside the actual subject of modern Greek. You know, the sort of general interest in the university and in the public at large. You know, I mean, it is nice at the moment. Maybe I don't know whether you've travelled on the London Underground in the last few days, but there is something called Greek Poems on the Underground, at the moment,
No,
because
yeah.
Greece holds the presidency of the European
Yes,
Union.
yes.
True.
They've actually got, on underground trains, they've got some Greek
Ah,
poems,
yeah.
ancient Greek and modern Greek.
Nice.
And I saw,
So-
when I was in London the other day, I saw something of Sappho, and then there's something of Kavafis as well, Ionikon, in Greek and in English, which is very nice. So that raises the profile of Greek. So it's nice to know that, you know, there are people around outside Greek studies who are interested in modern Greek things.
Might be the
Occasionally.
crisis as well.
Yes, now the
And
crisis,
crisis,
then,
of
yeah.
course, yes, that's right. There's a tremendous
Reintroduces Greece.
yeah, I mean, there is a tremendous sympathy for Greece, you know, in Britain, among certain people, and then among other certain people, of course, there's no sympathy.
No,
Mhm,
no
yes,
sympathy
of course,
at all.
But I don't think I want to talk about that because that's not my.
Shall we discuss your research and publications,
Yes.
Yes.
perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, you see, when you asked me to kind of prepare my thoughts in advance about this kind of topic, I find it very difficult because some people, you know, are the world experts in X. You know, they have written books and articles all about this one X, and sometimes this X is very big, of course. In my case, there are a lot of tiny little X's and nothing really big, because I've written about language, that is practical language, you know, grammar. I've also written about linguistics, and particularly sociolinguistics, and then from that, you know, things like language ideology, language myths, as they call them, and of course the language question, the glossikozitima, language ideologies, linguistic nationalism, that kind of thing. But of course, I've done literature, and I have done a little bit of history as well. But history, my publications on history have all been to do with sort of development of nationalist ideology, really. So, you know, I have published chapters or articles in the last few years about, you know, sort of Greek, what can I say, Greek attitudes to the difference between their own culture and other people's cultures. You know, why are the Greeks different from others? You know, that kind of ideology. But as you know, I mean, I've concentrated in the last few years particularly on the history of the language question.
The glossia.
And the glossia. And in fact, I'm continuing to publish about these things. But it's not all just the glossia, it's not all the Demotiki Katharevousa, because one of my publications that is just about to be published is something, it's a chapter in a book edited by a young scholar called Vali Litra. And she has got a volume together which is about Greek, I think it's called Greek-Turkish Encounters. Anyway, it's to do with encounters between Greeks and Turks and between Greek and Turkish cultures. And I've got a chapter in there about attitudes by Greeks to Turkish words and other Turkish linguistic material in Greek. What sort of attitudes do Greeks have to all these Turkish words that are in Greek, like kalendi and kefi and chavales and all these words that are often used, you know, used every day. I won't go into details about it because, you know, people will be able to read it eventually when it comes out. But that's the sort of thing I'm interested in, not just the language itself from a grammatical point of view, but also people's attitudes to the language. And of course the attitudes to the language were very much behind the language question, the glossikozitima, which for me is one of the most important and fascinating aspects of what is called the making of modern Greece, you know, the history of the Greek nation and state from the late 18th century onwards. But I think it's also symptomatic of what I see as a very negative aspect of Greek intellectual history, and that is this delusion, if you like, that Greeks are some kind of special case, that they are a chosen people, you know, like the Jews are, that there's something intrinsically superior about Greeks, and something intrinsically superior about the Greek language. You know, I think this has been tremendously this has had a tremendously bad effect in Greece. And I think it may have something to do with the causes behind the present crisis, but I won't go into details about that because this is just hypothesis. But I think the language question to me is a sort of symptom of an unwillingness by some Greeks at least, often some leading Greeks, to face up to reality. In this case it was facing up to the reality of the modern Greek language and modern Greece, and trying to see modern Greece through the prism of ancient Greece always. This glorious history and all that, and then the modern Greeks having this glorious history could be very proud of themselves, which actually meant that they didn't really need to make much of a mark in the world themselves because they had the ancestors who had already done it for them. And I think this was actually negative in the sense that it was debilitating. I think a lot of Greeks probably felt, well, what can we do when our ancestors who were so brilliant, we can't possibly surpass them, so what are we going to do? And I think although it's very nice to be made proud of your ancestors, in a way, you can become too proud of your ancestors, and it can be confining intellectually and everything else, and it can confine your originality. I mean, I remember reading recently. I wish I had the quote in front of me. An Englishman writing about England, not about Greece, saying, people talk about we're proud of our ancestors. Why should we be proud of our ancestors? I mean, why should we be proud of what people did generations ago? What's that got to do with us? We should try and do things that we can be proud of ourselves, not proud of ancestors. So it's not only confined to Greece, of course. This pride in ancestors. It's quite a universal phenomenon, I suppose. But I think in Greece it went rather too far.
Do you think that it was also non-Greeks that expected from Greeks to be the direct descendants of the ancients?
Yes, of course it was. Because obviously the rediscovery of ancient Greece by the Greeks themselves coincided with the Greek Enlightenment, which, as we know from Paschalis Ketomelidis and others, was the great movement that led up to the revolution, the War of Independence, and it could be said that without the discovery of the Greeks, of the ancient Greeks, the revolution might not have happened. But I'm talking not so much about just being proud of the ancestors. I'm talking about, I'm not talking about only this interest that modern Greek intellectuals have had in the ancient Greeks. I'm talking about when it becomes an excessive interest and it becomes an obsession, almost sort of paranoia. It's very difficult to define, but clearly, when modern Greeks did start to discover the ancient Greeks in a big way, not just a few intellectuals, but the whole nation, as it were, beginning to understand about the ancient Greeks and the fact that the modern Greeks were descended from them. I'm talking about around about the year 1800. Clearly, it must have been a great positive incentive as well. It made them more keen, more eager to become independent from the Ottoman Empire, because they felt this pride in their ancestry. They felt that they also felt a shame in the fact that they were slaves to the Ottomans, and that they deserved a better future. So that it did give them a positive incentive to fight against the Ottomans. But unfortunately, in language, it was something which really held things back. And I remember when I was working with Richard Clogg in the 1970s, and with other colleagues from London. I should have said I was working on a project on the origins of Balkan literary languages in the 19th century. And I remember noticing how, in the middle of the 19th century, Romanians could be writing quite realistic short stories and novels, quite realistic plays, dramas and that sort of thing, at the time when Greeks were hardly writing anything that was realistic, right in the middle of the 19th century. Because they were all sort of taken over by this nationalist ideology and the antiquity and the progony and all this sort of business. And as you know, realism really only started getting into Greek literature in the 1880s.
Later.
Very late, you know, compared to the rest of Europe. I mean, the Greeks were behind, and they were even behind some of the other Balkan countries in that respect. And I think it's because of this obsession with antiquity.
Yeah, you experienced the transition to Δημοτική after the Huda.
Yeah.
Was this an important, perhaps, impact on your research?
It was, yes. And I mean, I when I was an undergraduate at Oxford, both my chief teachers, that's Robin Fletcher, who of course was an Englishman, and Konstantinos Tripanis, who was a Greek, they were both demoticists.
Yes.
Robin Fletcher was really a very committed demoticist, and he used to give lectures on the Glossikozitima. In fact, it was his lecture that lectures in the 1960s that eventually inspired me to write my book about the Glossikozitima. And Tripanis also wrote a small book about the Glossikozitima, about Atticis and Attikismos, in fact. That was after he returned to Greece, after he was Minister of Culture in Greece. So they were both very much, they both led us students to believe that Dimotiki was and should be the natural language of Greece, you know, the genuine language of Greece, the proper language of Greece, to be used for all purposes, literature, government, you know, everything. And then of course I was living in Greece under the colonels, where it was all Katharevousa, and I had some interesting conversations with people I met who, some of whom were very conservative, and said that, you know, who argued against my support of Dimotiki, and said Dimotiki, they would say it's like Cockney. It's like Cockney. It's all slang. You know, you're an Oxford student. You would not write in Cockney, would you, if you were writing an essay? I said, but no. Anyway, I tried to explain to them, without any success, of course, that Dimotiki was nothing like Cockney. We're not talking about two completely different things. They were not comparable. It was quite a widespread idea,
Really?
actually. This propaganda that people had got in Greece, not just from the colonels, but before the colonels. I mean, generations and generations of school teachers teaching Greeks that their spoken language was corrupt, incorrect, shameful. You know, I mean, this is what I mean about the negative impact. I think it had a very negative impact on the psychology of a lot of Greeks from early childhood, when they went to school, being told, not only being told, but being beaten for using, you know, spoken language. And always being told that they had to find a kaliteri lexi.
Yes.
You know, you mustn't say miti, you must say ris. You know, well, why?
Yes.
You know, for God's sake. It's like in English, you know, saying to somebody you mustn't say nose, you must use the Latin word for it. You know, I mean, why? But then when the colonels fell, suddenly you got this phenomenon in Greece from being a situation of diglossia, or diglossia, diglossia, I don't even know how to pronounce it in English. It's of course, actually, by the way, I should say that the word diglossia is, can I say this on film, is probably the only modern Greek word that has become part of the international scientific vocabulary. It was invented by Emmanuel-Roidis, as you probably know,
Yes.
in 1883, and then it was popularised in France by Psycharis, and then from France it came to England, etc., and the rest is history. But not many people in linguistics outside Greece actually know that this word actually originated in Greece, because it's used, you know, about the whole world. But I think Greece is the only situation, even though it was one of the paradigmatic situations of diglossia until 74, it's probably the only culture where diglossia has disappeared and has been replaced by monoglossia. Because, you know, Ferguson, who wrote this article in 1959 about diglossia, and he talks about Greece, and he talks about the Arab countries, he talks about Haiti, and he, according to him, diglossia is going to be here more or less forever. You know? At least it's going to take generations. But from 1959 to 1974, it was actually only 15 years. So from 15 years after he wrote his article saying that it was here for generations in Greece, it was actually disappearing. So that's quite interesting. So this great linguist was proved wrong. And so it's very interesting for linguists to look at the Greek situation, what happened after diglossia, and how Greeks adapted themselves to the monoglossic situation. In fact, they adapted themselves quite easily and quite unproblematically. I mean, at the beginning, it was quite hair-raising to read some of the official documents that came in, you know, the encyclicals in Gikli that came out of the Greek ministries, where they were trying to write in Demotiki and they didn't really know what to do. But, you know, gradually people got used to it. A lot of people made a lot of extremes. A lot of people, you know, came out with a lot of extreme forms, thinking, you know, we mustn't say eprokito anymore, we must say prokitan, you know, which didn't last very long. But, you know, in the middle of the 70s, people were using that. And then it settled down. But it's been very interesting to watch, to observe this. And I think that was why, well, it was why I wrote my first book, The Modern Greek Language, which was published in 1985, because I wanted to try to capture this process of Greek going from a diglossic to a monoglossic situation, and that was the time that it was still going through that process. I mean, more or less the end of that process, really. But the time that I was doing my research on it was during that process. And the research, I always tell people, the research I did was a lot of reading, of course, a lot of reading, a lot of listening to Greek radio, watching Greek television, but also just listening in to Greek conversations. And because Greeks speak loudly, Greece is an ideal situation for linguistic fieldwork, because you can just sort of sit or stand somewhere near a group of people and you can listen to them, and you can even have a tape recorder going or a recorder without their knowing. And I used to spend a lot of time standing around Pigadakia in Ammonia, listening into people's conversations, you know, political arguments or arguments about football and that sort of thing in the late 70s and early 80s. And that was great fun. That's how that book came to be written.
You have also worked on Pontic Greek.
Yeah,
which at the time that was a pioneering aspect.
Yes, that's right.
Of
I mean,
research.
One of the things I said to myself when I started teaching in the 70s was, I'm never going to be interested in modern Greek dialects. Well, Anthony Breyer, who you must know of, who's this great professor of Byzantine studies at Birmingham, now sadly not well, but we did visit him last week, and he's still going. He is an expert on Byzantine Pontus, but by going to Pondos and studying the Byzantine buildings, remains, he also became quite knowledgeable about the history of Pondos in the Ottoman period, without being a linguist, though he wasn't a linguist. He is not a linguist. He would be telling me, because we became friends quite early on, he'd be telling me about Pondos and how fascinating it is. And because I'm interested in Turkey, my wife and I had already been going to Turkey on holidays sometimes, and we thought, well, why not go to Pondos for a change? And also Greek, I'd heard from Greeks that, you know, people, Pondi from Greece, were going there already, beginning to go to Pondos, and they would go there, people to see, you know, to see. If they were very elderly, they were going to see their own homeland, or if they were younger, they were going to see the homelands of their parents or their grandparents. And they would find people there who spoke Pondiaka. And so I thought, I didn't go there in order to study Pondiaka, because I didn't really know. I thought maybe this was an exaggeration, you know, this was sort of romantic idea that people still spoke Greek there. And Breyer didn't know much about it, but Breyer did give me some names and addresses of people to contact when we got to Trebizond, and while we were there, we met a very friendly man in the Maidan. They use the word Maidan there, as they do in Kiev, of course, meaning the main square. A shopkeeper, and I've always told people in Turkey, even at the times when Turkey and Greece did not have good relations, I've always said I do modern Greek, I teach modern Greek, just to see what their reactions are, you know. And the reactions have usually been very positive, I have to say. And, you know, people have usually expressed great, you know, friendship and brotherhood, etc. for Greeks. Anyway, so this shopkeeper in Trapezunda was one of them. And he said, do you know there are people in villages here, near here, where they still speak Greek? And I said, well, I had heard such stories. He said, look, I have a friend who's a school teacher in one of those villages, and at the weekend, if you like, we'll go up there together. So this guy took us up there, and he introduced me to my first, Greek-speaking Turks in Pontus. And I was so excited by this, to meet these real-life people who were still speaking Greek, Pondiaka. I didn't know Pondiaka, so, we couldn't understand very much of what we said, but they would say a few things that I can understand, and I said a few things in Greek that they could understand. And I thought, I really must do something about this because nobody's done anything about it.
Yeah.
So I then spent some time learning Pondiaka in Greece and through Greek publications, and then got a small amount of research money and went back and spent I went on 2 trips to a village near Trapezunda called Sarachos, where they all speak Greek, the whole village, all generations, and that's the normal language of communication. And I started doing field work there. Now, I couldn't take a tape recorder with me because it was too dangerous. In order to do field work in Turkey, certainly in the 80s, this is the 80s, you needed to have a permit from various authorities, and I knew that if I applied for a permit, they would say no.
You wouldn't.
And if they said no, then they would be very suspicious if I was there.
Yeah.
So I thought, right, I won't apply. I went with my wife.
Incognito.
I remember going to see a man called Odysseus Lampsidis, who was the president of the Epitropia, I think it was called Epitropia, not Epitropie, Pondiakon Meleton in Athens.
Yes.
And one of the things he said to me, I didn't mention that I was going with my wife, when I said, have you got any advice for me, he said, Min pate me gineka. So anyway, I took my wife, and actually it was the best thing to do because we were there as tourists. I wasn't there I didn't tell them that I was studying the language. I told them that I taught modern Greek and I was interested in the language, but I didn't say that I was working on a kind of research project.
He was very conservative.
Yeah. And so what we used to do, we used to sit around in cafes and collect information in our heads, sometimes writing things down. And then we would say to our friends, oh, we're just going off for a walk now into the hills. We'd go off into the hills with our notebook, and then we would write down as many things as we could remember we had heard from these people. And if we disagreed, my wife and I, then we would go back and ask them, which was the word you said for so-and-so? Was it so-and-so? So it's not a very good way of doing field work, but anyway, it was a start. And then I abandoned that actually after these 2 visits because I wasn't getting very far. But the important thing that I discovered was that there is this thing called the Pondiako aparemphato, the Pontic infinitive. Now, some scholars in Greece had been writing about it since the 19th century, and then modern, let's say progressive scholars in the 70s had tried to do some investigation on this. They hadn't discovered it at all in Pondiaka in Greece. Nobody had actually heard of it among the Pontic community in Thessaloniki, for instance. Nobody seemed to use this aparemphato and they didn't understand it. And so therefore they assumed that it didn't exist, that it was either some kind of ideological construct, nationalist construct by some 19th century Pontians, or it was something that had existed but it had disappeared. Now I discovered that people were still using it in Turkey, and I have published about that. But actually, I have to say that some people in Greece have been very sceptical about my work in Turkey for ideological reasons which I don't understand, but they've sort of tried to be very negative about my work. Anyway, to go to the positive side, I rather abandoned the work because I didn't seem to be making any progress because I'm not a trained linguist, I've never studied linguistics, and I was waiting for some younger linguist to come along who I might be able to entice to push to go to do this work. And in fact there are now 3 people who for some years now, 3 younger scholars who have been working on Pondiaka in Turkey. One is a Greek, Ioanna Sitaridou, who teaches in Cambridge, so she's of course from a Pontic family, Sitaridou. Hasan Özkan, who's a German of Turkish parentage, whose family originally comes from Pontus and was originally Greek-speaking, and an Italian called Pietro Bortoni. These three people are all working on Pondiaka in Turkey, and I was Pondiaka as it's spoken in Turkey. And Ioana Sintaridu particularly is working on this infinitive, which is very, very interesting and very fascinating. And she's using much more modern methods of, videoing people and all that kind of thing. She doesn't have to rush off into the mountains with a notebook and write down things in secret, because now, with Greek-Turkish relations as they are, she can go there, people are not frightened anymore to speak into a microphone or whatever, and there's no problem from the police and all that kind of thing.
Since we've been talking about your research and publications, which would be another area of research you might be interested in actually saying a few more things?
Well, there's just one little thing. It's a very, very small topic in medieval Greek grammar, but it's something where I seemed to have discovered something which then seemed interesting to quite a number of younger scholars. I won't go into big details because it's a very, very technical point, but because of the diglossia situation, when we read medieval Greek, the so-called Zimosi grammatia, written in more or less the spoken language, there's so much influence there from ancient Greek, from the logia, paradosi, etc., that people have often thought of the medieval Greek that you find even in the Dimodi Kimena, they've thought of it as being artificial. They've been very suspicious about whether it really corresponds with any kind of natural speech. But I discovered that there are some very quite strict linguistic rules in all these medieval Dimodi Kimena with respect to one particular phenomenon. This is where I get technical. In some Greek dialects they say agapo, as in standard modern Greek. In other Greek dialects they say agapose. But everywhere where they say agapose, or almost everywhere, they also say agapo. But it's not just a matter of choice. The speaker never has the choice of which to say. It's always controlled by grammatical rules. And I won't go into details of what the grammatical rules are, but it's to do with syntax. And it's to do with semantic emphasis. And I discovered the rules that are operating in medieval Greek, which are actually the same as in modern Cypriot dialect, which is how I discovered it. That means then that at least in that respect, these medieval texts are being written in a language which is bound by normal everyday spoken rules. It's not a totally artificial language at all. And what I'm hoping is that other people will also look at other phenomena and come to similar conclusions about other phenomena. There are other people in the world who are now working on this, younger scholars. So that's something I'm quite proud of, apart from the Pontic research. You wanted to know something about a book that I'm co-editing about the activities of the British Council in Greece immediately after the Second World War. I realised some years ago that I'd always thought that this was a fascinating topic, but I'd realised that nobody really has written about it, or hardly anybody has written about it. And I decided to suggest to the British School at Athens, not the British Council, that they put on a conference about the activities of the British Council in Greece between 1945 and 1955. And that conference took place 2 years ago. In fact, I managed to get David Ricks as the co-organiser, and he and I are now working on producing a volume based on the papers, but not entirely confined to the papers that were given at that conference. It was a very interesting period because I think, and I haven't found any evidence against this, I think that Greece was the place where the British Council was most active in those crucial 10 years immediately after the Second World War, at the time when the Cold War was just beginning to start, and of course the Greek Civil War was happening. I think Greece was thought to be, especially if you remember that Truman in the Truman Doctrine in March 1947. It was actually on my first birthday, at the 12th of, not that I remember it at the time, the 12th of March 1947. The two countries that he singled out as being on the front line of the war against communism were Greece and Turkey. So Greece was considered by Britain and America to be an absolutely crucial country in those days, and that's why I think the British Council played such an important part. And also it played a much more important part then than it ever did later in Greece. And now it's just reduced to teaching English in a very kind of commercial way. It doesn't really do much of the cultural activities that it did in Greece. But in Greece, they were very lucky, very fortunate to have, or they're very clever to have some extremely good people, starting with Stephen Runciman, who the world-renowned Byzantinist, who was the director of the British Council for some time in the 40s, and his closest colleague was a man called Rex Warner, who was a classics scholar and a novelist and poet, who became a great friend of Seferis and Elitis and a large number of writers and artists who sort of congregated around the British Council and the Anglo-Ελληνική Επιθεώρηση, the journal that the Council brought out. And that period, that sort of heyday, finished in 1955, when AOCA started its military campaign on the 1st of April 1955, and from then on, all the Greeks involved, Severus and everybody, they all thought that, well, no, we can't really collaborate with the British anymore. I mean, I understand that absolutely, and they decided they couldn't carry on. So that's when the British Council really finished that 10-year period finished suddenly with the outbreak of the Cypriot hostilities. But it is a very, very, very fascinating period, and I'm looking forward myself to the book coming out. There was something that I should have said before. When I say Cold War, I'm now reminded of it. The circumstances in which modern Greek studies were flourishing in this country. I mean, it was, of course, partly the colonel's regime which made people, as I said before, made people in Britain particularly interested in modern Greece. But I think also there was the Cold War as well. My post in London, the King's College post, was set up in 1973, and it was a new post. And I said, I think already, that I was both at King's College and at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies. Now, the fact that modern Greek was part of the School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies means that Greece, although it wasn't in the communist camp, because of its geographical position, was seen to bear some similarities to these other East European countries. And because, of course, again, Greece was on the front line, being a borderline country with having borders with Albania, with Yugoslavia, with Bulgaria. And I think that's one of the reasons why my post was set up. Not that I have to say that there was nobody ever put any pressure on me to do any work for the Foreign Office or anything like that. I was left absolutely free to do what I wanted. But I think that's why the post was set up, and I think that's why there continued to be a big interest in Greece, not just because of classical studies, but because the ruling class of Britain had all studied classics, as it were, which was true, but also because of the contemporary importance of Greece to the Western world, the free world, as it used to be called. And then, of course, once the Cold War finished, just as there was a great nosedive in the interest in this country in Russia, then there was also a nosedive in the interest in Greece. What happened in Greece was no longer so important somehow. Just as what was happening in Russia, they thought at the time, was not very important. Of course, now it is important because of the international ramifications of what Russia's doing. So I think it's interesting. There are ideological reasons why modern Greek has been of greater interest to people in the 70s and 80s than it has been since then.
Can I ask if you actually reassess your research and your publications? Do you think that you had like a linear, let's say, process, or there have been changes or diversions or alterations, major turning points? that you consider to be important?
Yeah. I mean, I should say that I've carried out very few major projects. I mean, the only major research project I carried out. Well, no, actually, I'm talking about funding now. The only major research grant I ever got was for this research into what I called Greek Macedonian cultural identity. That is the development of a Greek Macedonian identity since 1912. And for that I applied to the Leverhulme Foundation and got a grant to employ my colleague Eleni Yannikaki as my research assistant, and we produced a book based on a conference and some articles on that. But apart from that, my research has been, I don't know, fairly random, if you like. I mean, I think I felt myself to be a completely free spirit, and I've just suddenly, you know, one day become interested in something, and I think, oh, I might write an article about that, or, you know, sometime later something else. That's why I keep going from language to literature to history. You know, I move around, and it's probably a good idea, because I think the language and the literature and the history all interlink. They all, you know, my expertise in all these three, although history is the least expertise, but anyway, all these things somehow influence each other in my mind and in my work. As for whether the progression was linear, certainly the stage I've been going through in the last 10 years, which is the years of my happy retirement, has been actually quite different from before. Not mainly because I've got much more time for research. I mean, research is what I do most of the time, whereas before I was doing teaching and administration. I should say, by the way, that when I was at Oxford, there were some terms or years when I was teaching 18 hours a week, you know, which is quite a lot.
That's a lot
for a university teacher.
That's a lot.
So I've been much freer to research, but I've been much freer to think as well. You know, to think kind of laterally. And I think, looking back, at the beginning, I was very. Perhaps I was, what can I say? Well, I was young and I was naive. Nothing wrong with that. But I think I was actually quite a lot influenced subconsciously by the Greek nationalist ideology. And I think I used to be criticised by some colleagues elsewhere whom I won't name for having sort of bought into the Greek nationalist ideology. I don't think I ever really bought into it, but I think I was influenced by it. It was a sort of perhaps an uncritical view, you know, of everything Greek being wonderful and beautiful and positive, etc. I've now become, you know, more sceptical, but then it's also to do with getting older. You know, you do get sceptical when you get older, and it's not necessarily a very happy thing to be terribly sceptical. But I think certainly in the last 10 years, I've actually extricated myself more or less entirely from sort of the vestiges of nationalist, Greek nationalist influence, I think, to the extent that, you know, I feel in my work on the language question, what have you, I'm kind of trying to expose the nationalist ideological assumptions behind the support of Catharevousa, for instance, the language purism in Greece. I suppose that's really what I would say, but not. There certainly hasn't been. What there has not been in my career has been a kind of planned progression. I've never sat down at some point and said, right, for the next 5 years I'm going to work on so-and-so, then the next 5 years I'm going to devote myself to so-and-so, and then the next 5 years. It's never been like that at all. I've just been attracted. I've been very lucky, I suppose, that in my research I've just been allowed to do anything I think is interesting to me, and I hope that what's interesting to me might be interesting to other people as well. When you asked me before the interview, you know, what are the most positive things that you've taken away from your interest in Greece, you know, I would say without any hesitation that the great joy for me and the great privilege that I've had in my life has been working on Greece, has been working in Greece, has been working with Greek colleagues, has been making friends with Greeks, and, you know, my life obviously has been completely different from what it would have been if I'd continued to study law at Oxford, got a degree in law and become a solicitor or something, you know, working on divorces and what. So, you know, it transformed my life, totally, absolutely transformed my life, and it transformed it absolutely for the better. I have absolutely no regrets at all. I mean, one of the best things I ever did in my life was to change from law to non-Greek, you know, because it really made me a very happy man. So, you know, I've been absolutely thrilled to be working on Greece all these years, you know, a lot of my best friends, most of my best friends are Greeks, I would say. And other people living in Greece too, because I've still got a lot of friends who I met in the 60s who are living in Greece, who are expatriates, who have been expatriates all that time. And I still go and see them. And, you know, this has been a great joy for me. So Greece has been, for me, a sort of, it's certainly become Δεύτερη Πατρίδα. It became that very early on. But it's become a country that I've been very emotionally involved in, which is why, you know, for the last few years I've been very distressed by the crisis in Greece, and, you know, wish I could do more to help and or whatever. Of course, you know, my view of Greece is definitely not, you know, the 100% all happy country that I thought it was at one point. It's not only my own age, but it's also what's happening in Greece itself. But Greece is a unique country. There it is in Southeast Europe. It's a Mediterranean country and it's a Balkan country at the same time. That gives it some absolutely special flavour, and the fact that it has the longest coastline of any European country, that's another one that gives it a special flavour. It is a unique country geographically, and from the point of view of its position sort of in the cultural world. The fact that it has got the antiquity, of course I was criticising the excessive, sometimes excessive, what can I say, obsession with antiquity among some Greeks. The fact that it does have antiquity, and the fact that it does have Byzantium, I haven't mentioned Byzantium at all in this interview, does make it, of course, much more exciting than it would otherwise be. You know, if one was working on Serbia, for instance, would that be so exciting? You know, Serbia doesn't have Serbian antiquity that one knows of. Of course, it does have a wonderful Byzantine past. Serbia, I don't think, has any islands. You know, there are all sorts of things where Greece wins out vis-à-vis Serbia. So, I mean, Greece, I'm saying this really, of course, partly jokingly, but I mean, Greece is in a very privileged position from a geographical point of view. It is in a very exciting area, you know, from the point of view of international history and international politics, isn't it, ever since ancient times and still today. And it's in a very attractive area too, aesthetically attractive for visitors, and I hope that tourism will continue to be successful in Greece, but I hope it will also be within limits, so that the tourism doesn't, you know, destroy the land that the tourists actually go to see in the first place.
Thank you.